Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be showing you how to paint this simple yet beautiful kind of abstract watercolor misty forest. And I get questions all the time about painting landscapes, and so in this video I'm going to show you my very simple tricks to make landscapes work for you every time. I am using 140-pound cold press watercolor paper that is in a block, so all of the sides are glued together. I am using a filbert brush size 10 and a Polina Bright brush size 2 and Winsor & Newton professional watercolor paints. To start, you want to wet your entire paper, and that's one of the reasons I'm using a block pad of paper, because when you wet your entire paper, you will have warping if it is not tacked down in some way. So if you have a regular sheet of watercolor paper, you can use masking tape or any kind of washi tape to hold it down. While your paper is still wet, you're going to want to drop in the color of your background trees. Now, because your paper is wet, the color will bleed a little bit, so it will really make these trees look misty and far away. So this color that you're laying down needs to be light. When you're looking at a landscape, things that are farther away from you are lighter, things that are closer to you are darker. In our little forest, I'm imagining a lot of ground cover and leaves and ferns and greenery just growing all over around underneath these trees. And so now I'm just doing these dabby strokes where I'm just blotting in some color around to get different highlights and shadow areas. So on the edges, there's shadowing. Towards the center of the greenery is lighter, as if light is coming in through the trees. And then you'll see here that I'm going to add in some darker areas in the highlight. That's to represent some shadows that are created when the light is hitting some of these leaves as well. So again, I'm going to be putting shadows along the left and right side too, because that is a darker area in our painting. So while our painting is still overall very wet, I am going in and adding even more strokes that are kind of coming up from the grass, and they're a little bit of a darker pigment. So these are maybe some trees or lines that we're seeing that are a little bit closer to us than the far away ones, but they're still misty because they're still kind of far away. So we're going to let this dry completely before we add our next layer. Once it's dry, we can start adding some of the trees that are a little bit closer to us in the painting, but aren't quite misty, and they're not the main focus of the painting, so they're still kind of in the background. So we're going to be using a lighter pigment of this gray that we've been using, but not as light as the ones from before. So a trick that I've learned with trees is while your paint is still wet, you can use the other side of your paintbrush to bring some tiny little branches out from your main branch, and it will look really organic and natural to have these little spiky branches coming out. I love this trick. I use it all the time when I paint trees, and I really think it helps make them more realistic looking. So just remember that when you're painting trees, try to use the tip of your brush as much as you can. Think about how wiggly branches can be and that they kind of go in all different directions, that some of your trunks and branches are thicker than others, and that will just keep it really organic. Also remember that some of your trees are falling over or are baby trees or leaning in a weird direction. So if you change things up with your trees, it will just make your whole painting look more realistic. When you paint leaves, keep in mind that some areas are going to be thicker than others on a tree, and you're going to represent those thicker areas of leaves with a bigger blob of paint. And then as the branch kind of tapers off, you will see less and less leaves, and so you're going to want to spread your paint strokes apart and also make them smaller. And so you can see I do really big blobs of paint, and then I do really, really tiny specks in certain areas. So just really switch it up, keep it organic, and don't overthink it, because you can really overthink it. Look at a reference picture, that always helps me. So as my trees here on the right are starting to dry, I'm adding a little bit of a darker pigment of paint to give some dimension, and you can see how this area starts to really pop and come alive as contrast is added. And now we're going to start adding a lot of contrast in the greenery down below. So I'm using a dark gray green, and I'm going through first to kind of define the contrast that will be in the leaves around these kind of mid-level trees. And don't be afraid to use paper towel. You can see throughout this whole painting I use it a lot. If it feels too dark or too stark, I dab it with a paper towel. So I added some of those dark leaves over to the right, but now I'm going to focus on some of the mid-tone leaves in the center. And so one thing to keep in mind, because this is my highlight area, I want to make sure to not get rid of a lot of the negative space. I want that bottom layer of lighter paint to shine through. So don't cover up the whole thing. Do your blobs, do your lines, and then also make sure to add some contrasting shadow blobs within your highlight so that it can represent the light hitting it and the shadows underneath those leaves. And just remember, at this point, it looks like nothing and it looks maybe bad, but we are building layers. So we have that initial very faint light layer that we started with, and now this is our middle layer. We're starting to create definition, but it still looks very light and not very interesting. Once this all dries, we're going to add another defining contrasting layer on top. So just remember that that's what you're building when you're painting in these random blobby shapes and these lines. You are building on each layer and the final piece will look great. So I'm just continuing to build each layer based on where I know there are shadows and midtones, and then making sure to add shadows around those midtones and lighter tones. And I'm also doing some flicking here too with some of the darker green paint. And don't worry, I'm going to flick the heck out of this painting later, so there's more of that coming. Now we're going to start painting some of our trees that are in the foreground. They're the main attraction, they're right in front. So they're going to be a darker grayish color that we've been using. And again, I'm using the tip of my brush to make the spindly branches. I also really like to use the tip of my finger to blend out the bottom of the tree so that it's not super stark against the grass. And then using the same technique with the leaves, but because this tree is closer, we can do less bigger blobs and more of a detailed looking leaf, because we're going to be able to see a little bit more details in the trees that are closer to us. Now that this tree has pretty much dried, I'm taking a slightly darker tone and adding a little bit of shadow and detail to the tree, because this adds such a great contrast to this tree. I'm also adding a lot of leaves that are darker. And again, this gives us contrast because it also represents shadow, which makes everything pop. I felt like this area in the center was missing more trees that were in the very far background. So you're going to see me pretty much paint this tree and then dab it away with a paper towel. This is another way you can get a really misty, far away look, especially after your background painting has totally dried. And don't forget to paint the tiny baby spindly trees, because I really feel like when you include those tiny elements of the tree, it really adds a lot of interest and contrast, because we didn't just do a bunch of very mature trees. And if you've been in a forest, you can see there's lots of tiny little baby trees everywhere. And so adding that element, I feel like really brings a lot of this painting together and adds so much interest. So this tree here on the right is kind of like our big mama tree. That's how I thought about it when I was painting. She's the main event, she's front and center. I made sure to bring her trunk down the farthest so that she is sitting closest to us. And that way we can make the leaves really dark, really standing out, because this is the closest tree to us in the painting. And so again, you see me kind of blending out the bottom of the trunk with my finger. That just helps kind of blend it into our grassy leafy area. But also I did a lot of leaves across the top because I wanted it to feel like this was a big tree, and she's so big and close to us that her leaves are just in control and over the top right there. And so because she has a thicker canopy of leaves, it's going to be bigger, darker blobs along the top. Now we are going to get into the darker contrast of the greenery that I was talking about. So this is our final layer of the greenery. It's a really dark green, and we're adding in shadows, details, high contrast, so that everything is starting to pull together. Our trees are pretty much done, and now we're just focusing on the greenery. I'm doing really dark green across the left and the right side so we can really enhance our shadowing, especially around the trunks of our trees. So make sure to do your greenery dark and heavy around your trees. And I also brought some of the dark green around the front, so we kind of feel like we're enclosed in this little foresty space. And then as you're coming to the center where it's lighter, you're still going to be doing some areas of the dark green because you want to represent shadow, but you're going to do smaller, more precise areas of the dark green in certain places. I'm adding lines and texture and really, really dark areas of contrast around some of these spots in the highlighted area. Again, I can say this a million times. When you add contrast, your painting pops. So adding those areas of darkness around your highlight highlights your highlight. So it's really needed. Try to look for any way you can add a contrasting darker color next to your lighter color, and it will look great. So now we're at the end of our painting, and that means we get to flick the heck out of it, which is my favorite part. So try not to overdo it and try to keep your darker tones in your darker areas. You can have a little bit of crossover of color into the lighter areas, but you can do lighter splatters in the highlighted areas too, so it doesn't get overwhelmed with a darker amount of splatter all over it. You can use a paper towel to kind of dab any areas that feel like it's too much or too stark. And then I also did some flicks around the trees to give a lot of little leafy details as well. And that is it. Thank you so much for being here while we painted this today. I really feel like this is a very simple way to get started with landscapes, and I hope you try it out. I will see you guys next week for another new tutorial. I hope you all have a fantastic day. Bye.